Okay, I'm going to kick off. All right, afternoon everybody. First of all, just like to say that we hope that you and yours are staying safe and well at this really challenging time. My name is Katie Jacobs and I look after HR leader activity and proposition for the CIPD. And I'm really pleased to be able to kick off the CIPD's series of coronavirus webinars with this one on furlough. Before we get onto that, I just want to acknowledge the incredible work of people professionals during this crisis. We know that you're all going above and beyond and working really intensely to support your people and your organisations, and we really hope that the content we're putting out and the community that we're providing is giving you some help. First of all, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping and then I'll get on to our speakers are. So firstly, just to say that we had an overwhelming response to this webinar and we hit capacity. We're investigating how we can increase capacity for future webinars. I'm really pleased that we actually have more than 500 people watching right now, which shows how important this is for people. Secondly, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on demand via the webinar section of the CIPD website, so feel free to watch it again or share it with colleagues and peers. Thirdly, we've had a lot of questions submitted in advance and we've collated quite a lot of them, as a lot of them are quite similar. If you want to submit additional questions during this session, I would ask you to please use the Q&A tab, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat box for questions. The chat box is not going to be monitored, and also it's quite distracting for speakers to have it popping up the whole time. Attendees are all muted, so any questions need to be asked by typing them into the Q&A, not by speaking into your computer microphone. And finally, I don't think we're going to be able to answer all of the questions with the time that we've got. If you have questions that aren't answered, CIPD members, I would remind you that you can access the HR Inform helpline. It's available 24/7 and you can get an individual response via that helpline. We're also updating our FAQs on the website every time we get new information, so please do keep checking on that. And we'll also be running more webinars and more opportunities for you to ask questions to experts. So just going to introduce our speakers. I introduce myself, Katie Jacobs. First up, David D'Souza, Membership Director of the CIPD. Secondly, we'll hear from Joe Broadbent, who is a council knowledge lawyer at Hogan Lovells. And finally, we'll hear from Andy Stevenson, HR Director of Waterstones. So these truly are unprecedented times. And as part of its response, the government has introduced a range of support measures, including the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. Now, part of this scheme allows UK employers with employees on PAYE to designate these employees as furloughed workers. But what does this actually mean? What does it mean in practice? What does it mean for businesses and HR? In this session, we're going to talk through some of the key issues facing people professionals and business owners and how you can consider furlough as part of your planning. I just want to say that full details on the job retention scheme are emerging in instalments, so we don't have all the information yet. We're going to do our best to answer your questions based on the details that we currently have, and we'll make it clear where there are gaps where we're unable to answer the question accurately at this time. But it's also really useful for us to hear where there are gaps and confusion, because our policy advisors can then feed that into the discussions that they're having with the Department for Business. So please do put in the questions, and even if we can't answer them, they're really useful for us in gaining insight. So I'm going to be quiet now. To kick things off, I'm going to hand over to David, who's going to give us a little bit more insight into the context. David.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, actually. My name's David D'Souza. I'm Membership Director at the CIPD. And what's happening at the moment is obviously the biggest challenge facing our members. It's worth, I suppose, taking into account the fact that everyone at the moment is operating against a horrific context in terms of being worried about what's happening in the external environment and having to deal with everything that's happening in work at the same time. As Katie mentioned, we're incredibly proud of our members and the work that they're doing. We've started a new campaign called HR Together, and we'll urge you to kind of look at details of that afterwards. But that allows you to nominate colleagues, peers, people in the profession who you think are doing an incredible job at these least pleasant of times. I was reading a book at the weekend, actually, about kind of global crises. And there was a term in it that was, we're facing a new abnormal. And I think you've heard the term new normal used a lot recently, but new abnormal is how it feels. Everything is different, everything has changed. There's not anything static in the way that we're working, in the way that we're interacting. And when something as profound a change as the furlough scheme comes out, it's very difficult for people to react to that at the pace that people expect within organisations. So I'm delighted we've got Andy here today to talk about that in terms of his experience, and we've got Joe in terms of the technical expertise. But I guess what I wanted to share with you is that it's okay to be uncertain at the moment. And it's very important not to cling to things that appear appealing because they are certain. And we're seeing that in terms of the way that people respond to the virus, in terms of myth and rumour and, you know, should you be gargling lemons at the moment to try and prevent transmission? Probably not. But I know that we're also seeing it around some of the technically complex areas. So we are expected in organisations to be the experts in these kind of spaces. Historically, we'll all have been used to, or certainly the people who are as old as me, would have been used to having big books on the shelves that we could pull down with case histories and be able to look through that and understand it through that lens. This is a new period. It's new legal obligations, new organisational and ethical obligations people are expecting us to meet. And I'd urge you just to keep looking for credible sources and to keep sharing problems within communities, but particularly credible sources. So many of you have contacted us about Martin Lewis. I'm going to say the name out loud on this. And Martin's very proactive urgings to basically furlough anyone that you've met, even in passing. And certainly those who've worked for your organisation in the past are requesting it. Our guidance remains: follow the actual law, the obligations, things that are set out there. If you can do more for people, then certainly do. We want people to be compassionate. We want employers to be supportive, but being aware of what your actual obligations are and actually the boundaries of that are really important at the moment. So we will continue to be a source of what we hope is consistent information. I would also urge you in these times to look at the opportunity to think about how you're treating people within your organisational context and making sure it's as fair as it possibly can be. And that's difficult for almost every business in different ways. So whether your people are at the absolute front line of facing this, or whether it's the absolute opposite and your business is facing some really difficult questions about its existence, we have an opportunity to be compassionate in whatever we do and to treat people with dignity in whatever we do as well. And my final kind of urge to you is to use the communities that you're part of. It's almost impossible to keep up with the speed of change that we're currently facing, but it is possible to pull on the skills and the capabilities of others. It's equally important to pull on that for support as well. So Katie urged you at the end of this, if you've enjoyed it or if it's helped, don't just kind of bank that, share that with your peers, share that with your colleagues, make sure that information is out there. The same, make use of our communities and our sites to share that information. It's really important that as a profession, we rise up to the challenge that we have in front of us. So I hope the next hour is really useful for you. We will keep doing these, so keep looking out for content from us, for positioning from us. We are genuinely trying to influence government as much as we can around the right thing to deliver what we have always termed better working lives, but actually at this time are incredibly different working lives for people. So I will leave in the hands of the experts, but wonderful that you've all joined us today, but please do share afterwards.
Thank you so much, David. Now I'm going to pass over to Joe from Hogan Lovells, who's going to give an employment law perspective. And just a reminder, Joe, you need to unmute yourself, but you also need to tell me when you want your slides moved, and I will do that.
I will remember. Excellent. If we could move to the next slide, Katie, and the one after that. I thought we'd start just with a quick overview of the points that I wanted to cover in the next 20 minutes or so. So firstly, we'll have a high-level overview of the scheme and why you might want to use it. I'm then going to move on to the mechanics, and that's really in relation to which employers and which employees are eligible, how you should think about notifying employees about furlough, although obviously I'm going to defer to Andy's first-hand experience of that. He's going to be talking about that a bit later on. And then I'll move to how you can apply for the scheme and when we think it's going to be up and running. Then we'll look at some points about what happens while employees are actually on furlough and what we think is going to happen when the government retention scheme comes to an end. And then I'm going to finish with a few areas where we think more clarity is needed. And I think, unfortunately, we could probably have spent the whole of the session on those areas, because the answer to what areas still need clarifying is really quite a lot. And that really isn't intended to be a criticism of the government or of HMRC. I think they're doing a fantastic job trying to put a really complex scheme in place in a very short space of time. It's not surprising that the finer points haven't been covered and worked out, but I think it does make it really difficult for employers that are trying to implement the scheme properly. I think I'd echo David's point. It's really unhelpful that we're seeing information coming out in dribs and drabs, some through official, some through unofficial sources. That makes it quite difficult for employers to know what it is they're meant to do. But I have been told that we're expecting further guidance out later today. So hopefully that further guidance is going to provide a bit of clarity around these areas where we're still looking for details. If we could move to the next slide. Just a high-level overview. As you'll know, the government announced its job retention scheme on the 20th of March and then published further information about how the scheme is intended to operate last Friday. In broad terms, what the furlough scheme is basically a government agreement to subsidise wages, or some employees' wages, for a period initially of up to 3 months. So employers place employees on furlough. Those individuals remain employees, but they've been placed on temporary leave and they won't be performing any work for the employer, and the employer will continue to pay them. The employer can reclaim 80% of each furloughed employee's regular pay, as it's termed from the government, up to a maximum of £2,500 per employee per month. And employers are also going to be able to reclaim employer NICs and minimum employer auto-enrolment pension contributions on the sum that's being paid to employees. And the aim of the scheme is clearly to help employers avoid large-scale redundancies in the short term. It gives employers financial support effectively to lay off their staff temporarily in the hopes that businesses are going to be able to reopen once the current public health emergency is over. Although that's the aim, there isn't actually anything in the guidance to say that it's only employees that are at risk of redundancy because of COVID-19 that are eligible, or that employees would otherwise have to be formally at risk of redundancy in order for the scheme to operate. And again, it may be that we see a bit of further guidance around that this afternoon. The scheme is initially expected to operate for 3 months from the 1st of March, and the government's due to review in mid-May and take a decision about whether to extend the scheme at that point, and presumably that decision will be taken in light of what social distancing measures and requirements are in place at that point. Moving to the next slide, turning to the mechanics of the scheme. Fair to say, I think that the scheme is very wide-ranging, and any private sector employer with a PAYE payroll scheme and a UK bank account is eligible to apply. Public sector employers are eligible, although the guidance indicates that the government expects that take-up in the public sector won't be widespread because most public sector employees are going to be regarded as providing essential services, but I think it's possible that you could access it in the public sector in some probably fairly limited circumstances. In terms of employees, and the term employees seems to include workers who are on PAYE, employees are eligible to be furloughed if they meet various conditions. I think the first of these, and a really key one, is that employees must have been on the payroll at the 28th of February. Anyone who joined an employer after that date isn't going to be eligible to be furloughed under the government scheme. Individuals can be engaged on any type of contract, so full-time employees, part-time employees, those on 0 hours contracts, employed agency workers are all eligible. If somebody is on sick leave because of COVID-19, for example, the guidance says you should retain that person on statutory sick pay, but they would be eligible for furlough once the period of sickness absence ends. And the guidance also implies that somebody who's on maternity or some other form of family leave can be placed on furlough, in which case the employer would be able to reclaim any enhanced maternity pay or other family pay that's offered in addition to statutory pay. It's not at this stage entirely clear how that's going to work in practice. And what we'll do is come back and look at some of those issues at the end of the session. Moving to the next slide. Quick look at who can't be furloughed. So as we've seen, anybody who's joined the payroll after the 28th of February isn't going to be eligible. The guidance also says that somebody who is already working reduced hours or for reduced pay won't be eligible. So employers that have put other responses to the coronavirus crisis into place on the face of it aren't eligible. What's not clear is whether or not you would be able to agree with those employees to reinstate their original contract terms and then place them on furlough. Nothing in the guidance to deal with that, or on the face of it, there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to do that. And then anybody that was on unpaid leave that started before the 1st of March, again, they won't be eligible to be furloughed. A key issue is obviously whether or not you need an employee's consent to be placed on furlough, or whether you can simply notify them of this. The answer to that, I think, is that in most cases you are going to need consent, and that is particularly the case where what the employer is intending to do is simply flow through the subsidy that they're receiving from the government, i.e. they're not planning to top up wages to an employee's normal pay. There may be some limited circumstances where you don't need consent. So, for example, if you've got a contractual right in the contract to lay somebody off, or where somebody doesn't have an entitlement actually to be offered work. But as a general rule, you are going to need consent. And the guidance also says that you need to have a written record of the decision to place someone on furlough in order to be eligible for the scheme. And clearly that would be a matter of sort of prudent and normal business practice in any event. Just as a practical point, and again, I'm sure Andy will pick up on this, it's clearly really important to get the tone of communications with employees right, so that they really understand what it is you're doing and why that's the case. The duty of trust and confidence is still going to subsist in relation to employees who are on furlough. So obviously you need to think about behaving in a way that is consistent with that duty of trust and confidence. Moving to the next slide, thinking a little bit about how employers can actually apply for the scheme. Important to say that it isn't up and running yet. Clearly it's a brand new scheme. HMRC are having to set it up from scratch, but they are anticipating that it will be operational by the end of April. And at that point, it will be possible for employers to apply to be reimbursed by HMRC for the wage costs that they've incurred while employees are on furlough. And that reimbursement is obviously going to be subject to the limits that we've already talked about. I've noted on the slide the key pieces of information which you will need to provide. I'm not going to go through that in any detail because it's pretty self-explanatory, and it's set out in the government guidance on the scheme, which is available on the gov.uk website, so you can look that up there if you need to see that. Moving to the next slide, there are a few points I think it's worth making about what happens while an employee's on furlough and how that process is going to work. I think the first point is you don't necessarily have to furlough an employee for the full 3-month period. Where businesses have had to close, that may well be the only option, but where there is still some work to carry out, you're not necessarily going to want to put someone on furlough for the full period. The only requirement in the government guidance is that any period of furlough has got to be for a minimum of 3 weeks. I think you also don't have to put the whole of the workforce onto furlough. You can choose who is going to be furloughed. That would obviously be subject to the normal principles about not selecting people for furlough in a way that is discriminatory, for example. So you could potentially, I think, choose to share the pain, as it were, of furlough by rotating different groups on and off. so that everyone in the organisation or everyone performing certain roles has a period of furlough and a period of work, and that might well be suitable for some organisations. Just a slight word of caution on that. There was a question this morning on one of HMRC's webinars on the job retention scheme about rolling off and rolling on to furlough. They didn't specifically answer that question about whether you could roll off and roll on, and just said that further guidance would be provided, but I certainly can't see anything in the guidance at the moment that would prevent an employer from doing that. Second point, fairly obviously, is that the amount that the employer recovers from the government through the scheme has got to reflect what has actually been paid to the employee. So you can't furlough somebody on the basis that they'll receive 70%, for example, of their normal pay and then reclaim 80% from the government. But it is also clear that there isn't any duty on employers to top up wages to the full 100%. I think some employers are choosing to do that, but there isn't actually any requirement on employers to top up wages in this way. And it's also clear that there's no obligation to top up if the 80% of wages would take somebody below what would be the normal national minimum wage pay requirement. The guidance makes it clear that because someone isn't working while they're on furlough, there's no entitlement to the minimum wage. In terms of calculating what pay somebody's entitled to under the scheme, they're basically entitled to what's referred to as regular pay, but it's clear that that figure ignores fees or commission or bonus payments. And for a salaried worker, it's normally going to be the salary as at the 28th of February. The guidance doesn't say this in terms, but it seems that it's likely that that would exclude certain allowances that are paid on top of salary, such as car allowance. But again, we are waiting for clarification on that point. Calculating regular pay is more complex for workers whose pay varies, and in that case what somebody is entitled to is the higher of the pay in the corresponding month of the previous year. So for example, someone on furlough in April, you'd look back to April 2019, or their average monthly pay in the 2019 to 20 tax year. So again, you'd need to do that comparison to work out what regular pay was for somebody with variable hours. Moving to the next point, one thing that is really clear, and the government seems to be regarding as a sort of bright line, is that you cannot carry out any work for your employer while you're on furlough. And there doesn't seem to be any de minimis exception for that at the moment. So there's nothing to say that it's, you know, fine to carry out an hour of basic admin or whatever. And the reason for that seems to be in the interests of clarity and certainty, that it's easier to have a straightforward rule than it is to try and decide what level of work would be appropriate. The guidance indicates that employees can carry out training while they're on leave, provided that they mustn't be providing services to the employer or generating income for the employer by doing so. And it is also possible for employees to carry out with volunteering activities while they're on furlough, again, providing that it's not services for the employer. It's worth noting, I think, that if you do require employees to carry out training, you need to ensure that they're receiving minimum wage for the period of training itself. So particularly where you're only paying at 80%, that's going to be something that you'll need to watch. Again, not specified in the guidance, but it seems that all other benefits will have to be provided as usual during a period of furlough. Having said that, it might be possible to agree as a contractual matter that other benefits will also cease for a period, although you'd obviously need to consider whether or not that would make it less likely that employees would be willing to agree to going onto a period of furlough. And the guidance does specify that all other normal employment rights will continue as normal, such as the right to statutory sick pay, maternity rights, the right not to be unfairly dismissed, and the right to receive a redundancy payment. And as we'll see, there is still really quite a degree of uncertainty about how furlough leave is going to interact with some of those other rights. And that's particularly true, I think, in relation to holiday, where there are huge numbers of questions, and we'll come on and look at that in a little bit shortly. Moving to the end of furlough, as noted, the scheme is currently expected to end in May, but it could be extended if necessary. Assuming that the scheme does come to an end in May, claims for periods up to the end of May will continue to be processed after that date, but obviously you won't be able to reclaim wage costs in relation to a period after the scheme has come to an end. And what that really means is where a business has got employees who are still on furlough at the point at which the scheme closes, they're going to need to decide how to deal with those staff. So if businesses are able to reopen, obviously the hope and expectation will be that employees are able to return to work. But if not, the employer is presumably going to have to consider redundancies or other alternatives for redundancies, possibly staff agreeing to take a period of unpaid leave in the hopes that the business would be able to support a return to work at the end of that period. Businesses that have been able to remain open but have a reduced need for staff are also going to have to think about redundancies or potentially other cost-saving measures such as pay reductions or reduced working weeks possibly, and obviously some organisations are looking at that already. And then finally, as I've mentioned at the start and throughout this session, moving to the next slide, a lot of the detail surrounding furlough remains unclear. And I thought I would pick out 4 areas in particular that are causing quite a lot of uncertainty for employers that are trying to put this in place. I think firstly, the interaction between maternity leave and furlough remains unclear. And the guidance makes it clear that if an employee is receiving enhanced maternity pay and that employee is placed on furlough, the employer can reclaim any enhanced maternity pay as part of the scheme. And what that seems to imply is that somebody could be on maternity leave and furlough at the same time. Although obviously normally somebody who's on maternity leave would have to bring the period of maternity leave to an end in order to move on to some other form of leave. Now that's possibly less relevant for people who are in the sort of later stages of maternity leave, who would be expecting to return to work in the next couple of months in any event, but it's obviously going to be particularly important for anybody who's in the relatively early stages of maternity leave to know whether or not they're going to be able to restart that maternity leave after a period of furlough. And at the moment we just don't really know what the position is. The second really key issue is holiday, and I think that's a problem because it's not really covered at all in the guidance. The general view seems to be that unless there is legislation specifying otherwise, holiday is going to continue to accrue, statutory holiday is going to continue to accrue while somebody is on furlough. But then there's a real question about whether or not somebody could be required to take holiday at the same time that they're furloughed, and if they can, whether or not that could be paid at 80% or whether it would have to be topped up to the full 100% of pay for the holiday period. And the reason it's of concern, obviously, is that employers are really worried about employees coming back to work with the whole of their holiday leave outstanding, which then needs to be taken theoretically at least in the course of this year, subject to the working time extensions that I'll mention probably in relation to the questions. But employers are still pretty keen to ensure that workers are taking their holiday, regardless of the fact that it's obviously just going to be a break from work rather than a holiday in the normal sense. And I think the other sort of really difficult issue is if you can't take holiday and furlough at the same time, would an employee who either chooses to take holiday or who is required to take holiday, would that be treated as breaking a period of furlough, which potentially means that somebody hasn't been on furlough for the minimum 3-week required period? Key issue obviously is what bank holidays, sort of when you throw bank holidays into the mix, how that's going to interact. So again, hopefully the further guidance we're expecting later is going to cover those issues and at least give employers a bit of clarity on what they can and can't do. We've seen some ACAS guidance, and that's what HMRC is referring to, but I really don't think that that answers those detailed sort of technical questions. Third point, what happens if an employee who's furloughed then falls ill? The guidance says that somebody who's on SSP can't be furloughed until the sick period comes to an end. But what if you're already on furlough at that point? The guidance says that the entitlement to SSP continues. So it appears that the employer will be entitled to go either onto SSP or potentially to company sick pay at that point. And if company sick pay is on offer, that could obviously be financially advantageous to the employee. Or is the employer entitled to say that company sick pay actually isn't available during a period of furlough, and that in that case sort of pay will continue at 80%? And I think that may well depend on what the employer has said in its furlough letter. So you need to give really quite careful consideration to what your position is when you're notifying employees of the decision to put them on furlough and asking for their agreement. And then the final point, it's pretty clear from the guidance that an employer could choose to rehire employees who were made redundant after the 28th of February 2020 and then put them on furlough, and that's presumably, I think, designed to deal with the gap between the point at which the economic effects of coronavirus first really began to bite and the point at which the scheme was announced. But there's still a question about what happens to other employees, and there's been quite a lot of speculation about whether an employee who left after the 28th of February to start another job, but who subsequently lost that job because of coronavirus, whether the old employer could rehire them and furlough them. And there's been some suggestion that employers could do that if they wanted to, but it has to be said that those suggestions are not official, and I haven't seen anything from HMRC specifically confirming that. But I think the point to make is that if you did decide to do that, it would be purely voluntary. There's no obligation on you to do that. And it seems likely that quite a few employers are not actually going to want to enter into that complexity where they're actually under no obligation to do so. So that, at this stage, Katie, was all I wanted to say on the sort of legal aspects of the scheme.
Thank you so much, Jo. I see we've got so many questions, but I think you've actually answered quite a lot of them to the best of our ability right now, given there are so many unknowns. So before we get on to some questions, just going to hand over to Andrew Stevenson. Andrew is the HR director for Waterstones, and he's going to give a quick case study into how they furloughed a significant number of employees last week. Just a bit of a practical guidance of how it works. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Andy.
Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. As with pretty much all of you, I also had never heard of the word furlough not very long ago at all. But actually, we now have furloughed 94% of our entire company, which is a number into the several thousands. So we think we've got quite good at the process by this point, although I should point out that we have no more information than anybody else. A lot of this is our interpretation. We started to furlough our first wave of people actually from the 21st, so very, very early when this came out. By that point, we were already seeing some of our stores close because demand had dropped to pretty much zero in the locations that they were in, typically things like universities. So in a normal course of events, if demand had dropped that much, we would have been in a place where we were looking at redundancies. One of the interpretations we took early, which we think is completely morally right, and we hope will be proved to right, is we looked at how many people we would have cut from the workforce, and we compared it to the number of people we had in the company who were in the vulnerable categories. We therefore took a view at that point to furlough all of the people who were vulnerable, because it was broadly equal to the number of redundancies we would have made. We then redeployed people around the organisation. So we took a sensible decision to cut our numbers while protecting the people who we would. That very quickly made us realise that we needed to document all of our criteria. So one of the bits I'd most advocate is anything that you do through this furlough process should be done, as with any other good HR way, in a structured manner. So we created a furlough policy adapted from our redundancy one that very much showed the criteria we would follow and how we would select people for furlough as we went through. And at that point, we would not had any idea how many people we would do. It then came to a stage a few days later when many of our retail stores had closed, and by which time we would then need to furlough the bulk of our estate. So by this point, we now had an agreement template. We had a very nice letter we would write to people, and we had our criteria. The letter is very much the reassuring things that you would want to say to people about the fact that they are still employed, that we are still a viable business, we're looking to protect their jobs. The agreement is very clearly that. It is a variation of terms and conditions of your contract of employment. And it's structured in the same way as our contract. It's as legalistic as our contract. And it gave us the ability to introduce layoff clauses, to say that we would be paying people in full for March and we would for April, but giving us the contractual ability to reduce people to 80% of their pay going forward from there, and making that very, very clear. It also made very clear that we could turn off some of those discretionary payments, like car payments, if this continued for a time. And the key bit then was making sure that this truly was a consultation and that we had people signed up. Now, clearly, once we'd closed our stores, that was difficult. Fortunately, in that period between doing our first wave and the second, we had absolutely realised the importance of being able to communicate to people. We did an exercise to go and check what email details we had across the whole estate. What became really interesting was about 30% of the contact details we had in the company were right. And I do say that way around. So 70% of what we were holding was either solely an internal way of communicating, which wouldn't work when they were furloughed, or was out of date, or was incorrectly formatted. But fortunately, over that period of time, that literally a few days, we managed to correct pretty much the entire database that we had. That then we still needed to communicate out. Again, we had to think creatively. We didn't want the HR team sending out thousands of individual documents. So we looked at what we had, and within our business, our marketing function had a way of communicating en masse to individuals. So we were able, in a very data protected manner. So we were able to make use of technology that already existed in the organisation to send out thousands and thousands of documents to people with furlough agreements on them. We also then very quickly learned that there are ways for people to sign those documents without major pieces of technology being deployed. So we very quickly learned that if those documents arrived on iPhones, people could send them. So we sent the instructions to that with the document. We sent an equivalent for PCs and Androids. So everyone got a pack from us. They got a nice letter. They got a very comprehensive agreement. They got a very detailed Q&A, as much as we were able to at that point, and they got instructions how to send it back to us. We were anticipating huge amounts of pushback, questions, queries. One of the bits we quickly discovered is what we actually got back was just many, many documents, followed by many, many emails of thanks at how quick we'd done it, how clear our communication was, and the fact that we were absolutely clear that we were retaining employment. And clearly there's some thanks that we committed to paying up front as well. But I think one of the bits is, certainly for me and a lot of my team, we were expecting many of the complicated conversations you have in consultations, and much of that didn't happen. In fact, the four most common questions that came up for if you're putting anything is, one, how do I claim my furlough payment? So it isn't abundantly clear to people that we pay them and we deal with the claim aspect. So we have, for our final wave of people, put that in the Q&A. There are questions of, can I volunteer, particularly for the NHS? So we've again made that clear. We do get an awful lot of questions around, can I do some work? So there are lots of people who desperately want to do some work for the organisation, and in line with the legislation, we've been really clear that they cannot. And just to give you a practical example of how much we're enforcing that, so our employees regularly upload reviews of books onto the internet, and when they do that, they click a button to say they are a bookseller and therefore an expert. We've determined that even though you could possibly call that training, we've said if they do a review as a bookseller, that clearly could generate revenue for the business, and so we've removed their ability to do that. So that's just gives you an idea of how much we are being very clear that we're following our own process. And then the other question that I know lots of you got looking at the Q&A is what happens with holidays. Again, can only tell you our approach. We've decided that we will allow people's holidays to accrue, that we will take it. What we are doing though is sending them out a communication that explains how they will be required to take them when we come back to work. And we're effectively using what I call a flexible version of forced holiday. So we will be giving our people notice that they need to take their holidays in certain blocks of time. So not you must have a certain week, but you must have used X% by this point. And again, we're just being really, really clear with people and sending that out to them. We are sending out, while they're off, regular communications. We are sending them out things like that, the holidays. We're sending increased FAQs as things come up. We are constantly sending people contact to our employee assistance programme and to recommended government sites around things like debt counselling, health advice. So we're sending that out to people. And we are sending them comms around what's going on in the business, just so they stay connected. So what the people that are left behind are doing, what new books are coming out, and just keeping them connected to our world, even though they're not there. We're also very clearly communicating to the people left behind. One of the bits we've discovered is something I've dubbed reverse survivor syndrome. So in some cases, unlike a redundancy situation, there is some, and it's very little, but it's worth noting, there is definitely some people who are in a degree jealous that their colleagues are now at home on full pay while they are in, and in many cases, dealing with an increased workload. And while in the future we may look to do something for those financially, we are not a business. Clearly, we've furloughed 94% of our people for a reason. We're not the ones who can announce big pay rises for those people in the way that a supermarket can. So we are just relying on literally their goodwill and us really hammering home the message that they are keeping the lights on and keeping the business running. They are truly critical. And that tactic does seem to be working. We do seem to be getting an awfully well-engaged workforce, both within the people who are furloughed and the people who are left behind. So I guess my tips would be build a process, even if you have to put it together fast and quickly. Build a process in the same way as you would for anything else HR-wise. But communication is absolutely key. Make sure it is two-way. Make sure that you get the messages out to everyone, and that you get your Q&A updated with everything you can. And actually, the bit I didn't cover, sorry, in your Q&A, it is fine to have a few that say, we don't know. And as soon as we know, we will tell you. And so far, that seems to have done pretty well, considering this is something nobody's ever heard of. So there you go. Hope that was useful.
So I'm going to ask everyone to unmute themselves. And we got an awful lot of questions. I think that a lot of the questions, the answer is going to have to be, we don't know yet. I'm just going to pick up on holiday and annual leave first, because there are just so many people asking. And Andy, that was great for you to give a bit of insight into you doing that. Joe, can you share any more on kind of the accrual of holidays and the control employers can have over whether or not people are taking them, whether stuff can be carried over, for how long, or is that still all kind of up for grabs?
It's up for grabs. I think the position on accrual is that holiday will continue to accrue during furlough unless the government puts something specific in place to say that it doesn't. I think that would be compatible with the Working Time Directive if the government decided to do that, but it would need to take steps to do that specifically. And until it does, I think holiday does continue to accrue. Theoretically, employers can tell employees that they've got to take holiday on certain dates. There's nothing to overrule that at the moment. There are two issues there. One is the issue we talked about, is whether or not that would be deemed to interrupt a period of furlough, potentially meaning that an employee wasn't on furlough for that period and therefore the employer couldn't reclaim the wages. And the second point is, could we be in a situation like we are with, say, holiday and sickness, where there is a judgment that says employees cannot be forced to take leave during a period of furlough, in the same way that they can't be forced to take a period of leave while they're on a period of sickness absence. And I think the difficulty there is that the recent guidance issued by ACAS on holiday does appear to equate furlough with sickness, because it's given as one of the examples of situations in which it might not be reasonably practicable for somebody to take leave. So I think there are real issues there. I do think holiday is one of the things that will be covered in further guidance, because there are just so many questions around it, but we haven't got that guidance yet.
Andy, do you have any more you want to share?
I think certainly I'd agree with that. We've taken the view that we don't think holiday during the furlough period is going to be allowed. We're also very conscious that we think our employees will want and need holiday when we get back. So our balance is, that's our position, but our concern is we will still have a business to run. We can't let everyone be off at once. Our peak period will still be our peak period. And that's why we've tried to do the maths now. We brought, we know the holiday allowance for everyone, and therefore we can start to go, how will we best manage that? So hence us saying, if we get back to work at this point, and we hope that sooner rather than later, these are the blocks of time we'll need you to use that holiday up in. But absolutely, I agree. I don't think holiday during the furlough is likely to be allowed, or is something we would want anyway.
And just another, Katie, just one more point on that, the sort of the new carry forward rules allowing the basic holiday to be carried forward for up to 2 leave years. I think that does give employers some comfort that they're not going to be in a situation where the entire workforce wants to take the whole of December off in the run up to Christmas, for example, which, obviously for many businesses is going to be completely untenable.
Ian, got a few questions around employees who are vulnerable and shielding. So if somebody is at home and shielding, they've had a letter from the government, but there's a job for them to be working in, can you furlough them instead of having them on SSP?
Well, if they're shielding, I'm not sure they're entitled to SSP anyway. It will depend on the circumstances. Again, the guidance doesn't specify what you can do. I think probably the answer is yes, you could place those people on furlough, but what we need is a bit more clarity around whether this scheme is really only designed to catch people that would otherwise be at risk of redundancy, and there are a few mixed messages there. I think the answer will probably be yes, you can furlough those people, but just watch this space.
Got some questions about new starters. So if you've got new starters, can you put them straight onto furlough leave?
Not if they joined the payroll after the 28th of February.
Yeah. And a few people asking about whether they're getting, like you raised, Joe, people asking to be people that have either left the organisation or who have been made redundant. If you've made people redundant already, can you put them back on and furlough them instead?
Yes, the guidance says that if you've made them redundant on the 1st of March or after that 28th of February cut-off, then yes, you can rehire them and furlough them. I think there's quite a lot of uncertainty about that. For example, where you've made your statutory redundancy payments already, what happens about the statutory redundancy payment? Is the individual required to repay it? Nothing in the guidance that would cover that point. I think it's much more difficult where you've got employees that have left for some other non-redundancy related reason. And again, I guess the points there are, as we've said, one, it's just not clear from the guidance at the moment whether or not the government envisages that you could voluntarily rehire somebody in that situation and then place them on furlough. And secondly, where there's no obligation to do so, are employers really going to want to take responsibility for that?
Katie,
yeah.
One of the questions is, what are the CIPD doing about Martin Lewis?
Please go ahead.
So first of all, it's I can't really call him out for a duel. I don't think that's the way that things work these days. We are doing a lot of lobbying behind the scenes around policy and clarity. we would expect our members to utilise us as a source of truth rather than kind of external parties. It's really difficult to put once you've opened Pandora's box, and in many ways he has, by encouraging people to do that, whilst we can be very clear that we disagree with his advice or his positioning, probably, you know, the average person that's going to come and see you within an organisation, they'll have listened to Martin Lewis. They won't have come to us for a source of advice. So I absolutely understand the impact that he's having on professionals, and I think getting people excited about the prospect of extra income and then putting it on HR professionals to be the ones disappointing them is really bad. We will be in contact with him directly, but publicly calling him out will not add anything but noise to what's already a very difficult situation. So I understand that people are angry and frustrated, but we have to act properly to try and work out what's next.
I think the other bit, Katie, I'd just add on that, sorry, is I appreciate, you know, scenarios are different for everyone, and maybe some people won't have this luxury, but I do think there's still an element of the human nature of human resources. And we have had some people who did resign, and the job they were going to has gone for obviously lots of reasons of what's going on in the world. And we've taken a view that even if we can't claim they were a good employee for us for a period of time, and we have taken some of those people back on. And whether they stay or not is a different matter. But as I say, and I know everyone's scenario is different completely, but I do think it's important that as we do mass processes of thousands of people, that we remember there is individuals out there.
Just a word of lawyerly caution on that. Obviously, in any situation where you're doing some sort of selective, you know, rehiring, you'd need to think. I think you'd need a process in place that showed how you decided who to rehire and who not to avoid the risk of a discrimination claim down the line.
Absolutely, and one of the bits from the start, we have very clear documentation of every single bit that we're doing, and that I couldn't agree more, is absolutally vital.
It wasn't aimed at you, Andy.
No,
it was
no,
just you know, just a kind of general point.
It felt like you were telling Andy off the public.
Calling Andy out.
The process is absolutely key.
Yeah, got a few people asking what to do if people are refusing to be furloughed, and I know, Andy, you said that wasn't something that you experienced, and most people were.
We expected so much of that, and literally the queries across thousands of employees, I could count on my fingers, and those queries dissipated almost instantaneously when you had a conversation with them. So, you know, I'm sure out there it will happen, but our experience was it really didn't. And certainly some of the colleagues I spoke to in other businesses who are in a similar position to us also had very, very few pushbacks at all.
And I think that will be particularly true where you're topping up pay, because at that point it's clear to employees that they're not suffering any financial loss. More of an issue where what you're proposing is furlough on the 80%. You know, particularly where that's subject to the 2,500 cap, which could be a really hefty reduction in pay for some employees. I think if you've got people that are refusing, and depending on the numbers, really your option is to say to them, well, you can go on unpaid leave if you don't want furlough, or we're going to have to go through a termination process. And I think generally you're probably going to say, well, the alternative is redundancy. And depending on the numbers, you might be in collective consultation territory as well at that point.
Mm-hmm. Can we ask, it's probably one for you, Joe, do you think furlough can be used by public sector organisations? And if so, do you think they will be more scrutinised more closely than non-public sector organisations? And I'll add on to that another couple of questions that people have asked around how closely will HMRC be auditing, do you think, post this period?
Yeah, okay, the public sector, the clear steer from the guidance is that public sector organisations, generally it won't be appropriate for them to use the scheme, but there might be exceptions to that. For example, where staff are not deemed to be providing essential services, or employee pay isn't actually being funded by public money from government. So those are the sort of fairly limited exceptions where I think public sector organisations might be able to access the scheme. In terms of how closely HMRC will audit it, as you would expect, HMRC have reserved the right to investigate all claims that are made under the furlough arrangements. As with anything, that's going to be a question of resourcing. So I can't see a world in which HMRC has got the resources to investigate each and every claim, but clearly there is a risk that if you put a claim in and it's not right, it will be audited and you will have to repay the money.
I think my guess would be they'll prioritise it by sector, and also possibly by public sentiment. So I probably wouldn't want to be a football club right now.
Thank you. Got some questions about employees who have family who are key workers. Should we furlough them to avoid risk of contamination for the rest of the workforce? And kind of linked to that, I think employees who can't come into work because they're caring for their children, they don't want to take unpaid dependence leave. Can we furlough them?
I think it's a very similar answer to the one we gave before in relation to people that are shielding. That on the face of it, there's no reason you can't, but that is subject always to this point about, is the government going to come and say, actually, it's only people that otherwise you would have been making redundant? So depending on what the guidance says on that, we'll have a clearer position. But at the moment, there's nothing to indicate that you can't do that.
And can essential service employers access job retention scheme and furlough? That's one just came in.
Well, what do you mean? Workers. Things like sort of supermarkets and that sort of thing. I can't really see a world at the moment where supermarkets are going to want to furlough their staff, frankly. I mean, yeah, so I think the chances of sort of organisations that are providing key services accessing this are pretty limited, because they really are not going to be able to show that actually these people were at risk of redundancy if they weren't placed on furlough.
Yeah. And we've had a few questions about the national minimum wage increase next week. So should 80% pay take into account those? And I guess related to that, people asking about should they take into account their planned pay rises that are due to come in April?
I think planned pay rises, the answer is no, on the basis that the guidance says that how you assess pay for a full-time or part-time salaried member of staff is their pay as at the 28th of February. So I think pay rises that were due to take effect subsequently shouldn't be taken into account. The guidance doesn't expressly deal with the minimum wage increase. I've got a feeling I have seen something floating around saying that it should be taken into account, but again, I can't remember where I've seen that. What the guidance says is for employees on variable hours, you use the previous, the month in the previous year or the average in 2019 to 20. But it doesn't expressly deal with that. Again, I would expect to see that point clarified.
Again, from a practical point of view, I think part of it is what you put in the furlough agreement. So we agreed to pay everyone in full for April. We have therefore included our pay rises that were due to go through in April, because we are topping up and we're aware that that may mean us making up arguably more than 20%. But of course, we've been expressly clear that from May, we can vary the payment down to a different amount, and people are therefore completely aware if that becomes 80% of what they had before, then that's also fine. So I think again it's down to what you put in your furlough agreement and how upfront you are with your employees as to exactly what you're doing.
And I think you did touch on this, Jo, but we've had a few questions about kind of benefits and bonuses being calculations. So if I just ask you to repeat that.
Yeah, bonuses are clearly not covered in terms of what you can reclaim from the government as part of the 80% or £2,500. So bonuses should be excluded. Other benefits, the implication is those should be continued as normal, but I think that would be subject to whatever you put in the furlough letter. So technically, you could agree to change that if you saw fit.
Andy, what did you do about benefits?
We've done the same. So again, we've said we would pay them in full in April, but that people understood that would be reviewed each month and subject to the financial performance of the organisation, then we could take them away. And again, people were accepting of that. And I do think, as it was touched on earlier, I think if you're committing to pay everything in April, that clearly does make people much more comfortable that they agree you are trying to do the right thing.
And Joe, can you just clarify on the taking on of a second job while you're on furlough, where obviously, Andy, you've taken a policy line as your organisation, but in terms of HMRC's feelings?
So HMRC are slightly nebulous, I would say, on this. What the guidance covers and what all of the sort of Q&As I've seen from HMRC cover is a situation where somebody already has 2 jobs. And in that case, it's very clear that the fact that one of the employers has placed you on furlough doesn't prevent you from working for the other employer and potentially even doing more hours for the other employer. Whether you could seek new employment, that's going to depend on the terms of your employment contract. There might well be something in there that prevents you from doing that. And again, we would expect employers to point this out in furlough letters or furlough agreements. But HMRC hasn't specifically answered the question as to whether or not that would then prohibit you from receiving sort of furlough pay if you had taken on another job. It does seem to be against the sort of the spirit of the scheme, if not the letter of it.
So just to kind of come in on that, we will, because I've seen the questions coming in, we will be putting sample documentation on the website. I would just echo Joe and Andrew's point that actually you need to work out what works for your organisation in the right way as well, and there will be decisions to make rather than a blanket, this is how you do it, but we will get that documentation up, and I can see the questions coming through.
Yeah, so I'm actually, I think, going to have to wrap it up there because we've got to 1:30. So just one of my content colleagues, to follow up on what David said, said we are working to produce templates via HR Inform. Some are on the website and more are being added to HR Inform all the time, and that people can sign up for an HR Inform Lite account to get some downloads. And we'll also add templates to our website where we can. But as David said, obviously, there's a lot of contextual work for you to do there and working out what is best for your organisations and your context and your people. So I realise this is an incredibly complex and ever-changing topic. So I hope this helped to give some clarity in quite a short space of time and an overwhelming number of questions coming in there. As Joe, could you say, so are we expecting more guidance later today?
That's my understanding.
Okay, so hopefully as a nice Friday gift, there'll be some more guidance coming out of government and CIPD will obviously be working very hard to turn that into kind of accessible, useful content for you all. So just like to thank you so much to David and to Joe and to Andy for giving up their time and expertise. This webinar will be available on demand. So please, as David said, do feel free to share it with your peers and communities. Also, we realise that as this topic is kind of so live and changing, that we are looking at what other content and access to experts and Q&As we can put in place. So watch this space, we are working on it. And also look out for future webinars on other coronavirus related topics. We've got one on wellbeing coming up on Monday, and we will look to be doing some more around furlough next week. So thank you very much for watching, and yeah, that's it. I hope you all have a good afternoon and try and have a good weekend. Right. Thank you.